President HH signs Bill 7 into law today. What changes for every Zambian? After weeks of heated debate, accusations, and nationwide controversy, Bill 7 is entering its final constitutional stage. On December 18, 2025, President Hakainde Hichilema is set to formally assent to Bill 7 at a major ceremony at the Mulungushi International Conference Center. Why a grand ceremony? What message does this send, politically, legally, and symbolically? And what happens the moment the president signs? Good day, viewers. Welcome to another edition of InspirAfrica Official. I'm Nakash. We're halfway through December, and as many Zambians prepare for the festive season, something historic has just happened in Lusaka that will fundamentally alter the financial landscape of this nation. Today, we're leading with a story that has been months in the making, a legislative battle that has divided opinion, sparked fierce debate, and will now reshape the very foundation of how Zambia manages its resources. Picture this: a single signature on a document. A stroke of a pen. And in that instant, the rules governing billions of kwacha, your tax money, your national wealth, your children's future, are irrevocably changed. What does it mean when the guardrails of fiscal responsibility are adjusted? When the limits that once protected a nation from spiraling into uncontrollable debt are loosened, who truly benefits? And who pays the price? Is this a bold step toward economic flexibility and growth, or are we watching the dismantling of the very safeguards that stood between Zambia and financial crisis? When austerity meets ambition, when debt ceilings are raised in the name of development, what happens to the promises of fiscal discipline? And most critically, what does this mean for you, the ordinary Zambian trying to make ends meet in an economy already strained by inflation and uncertainty? Today, President Hakainde Hichilema has signed Bill number 7 into law. But what exactly is hidden in those pages? What changes today that wasn't possible yesterday? And why should every single Zambian be paying attention right now? Factual foundation, background and timeline. The revelation came to light this morning, Thursday, December 18, 2025, when State House confirmed that His Excellency President Hakainde Hichilema had officially assented to the Public Finance Management Amendment Bill number 7 of 2024. This bill has been the subject of intense parliamentary scrutiny since it was first introduced to the National Assembly earlier this year. The Ministry of Finance, under the leadership of Minister Sidambiko Muzokatwain, championed the legislation as a necessary modernization of Zambia's public finance management framework. The journey began in the first quarter of 2025, when the Ministry of Finance presented initial proposals to Cabinet, arguing that existing debt management provisions in the 2018 Public Finance Management Act were too restrictive for the country's current development ambitions. By March, a draft bill had been circulated among key stakeholders, including the Zambia Institute of Chartered Accountants, civil society organizations, and opposition political parties. Parliamentary debates commenced in September 2025, with heated exchanges in the House. The bill survived its first reading with relatively little controversy, but by the second reading in October, opposition MPs had begun raising serious questions about the implications of raising the debt ceiling and relaxing fiscal rules. The most contentious aspect? Bill number 7 increases Zambia's domestic debt ceiling from 45% of GDP to 65% of GDP, and raises the external debt ceiling from 60% of GDP to 75% of GDP. It also introduces new provisions allowing the Minister of Finance greater discretionary power in borrowing decisions during what the bill terms periods of national economic emergency. On November 28, the bill passed its third reading by 98 votes to 67, with the ruling UPND party using its parliamentary majority to push the legislation through despite vocal opposition from the Patriotic Front and Socialist Party MPs, and now, less than 3 weeks later, it has received presidential assent. It is law. Direct evidence. During the parliamentary debates, the exchanges were nothing short of explosive. Let me share with you some of the most revealing moments. Finance Minister Sidambiko Muzokatwain, defending the bill on the floor of Parliament on October 15, stated, "Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear about the intentions of this government. We are not, I repeat, we are not embarking on a reckless borrowing spree. What we are doing is creating fiscal space, necessary fiscal space, for critical infrastructure development. The roads that connect our provinces, the hospitals that serve our people, the schools that educate our children, these cannot be built on wishes and dreams alone. they require capital investment. He continued, the current debt ceilings were established in 2018 under completely different economic circumstances. We have since restructured our external debt, we have restored our relationship with international creditors, and we have demonstrated fiscal discipline. This amendment simply acknowledges the reality that development costs money, and that responsible borrowing, when properly managed, is an investment in our nation's future. But opposition voices were far less convinced. Patriotic Front Member of Parliament for Chiwama, Lawrence Sikelwi, delivered a scathing response during the debate. Mr. Speaker, I rise to express my profound concern, about what I can only describe as a dangerous gamble with our nation's economic future. The Honorable Minister talks about fiscal space, but what he's really talking about is debt. More debt. He talks about infrastructure, but we've seen this movie before. We've seen governments borrow and borrow and borrow, and then what happens? The debt becomes unsustainable, interest payments consume the national budget, and ordinary Zambians suffer through austerity measures while those in power live comfortably. Sikelwi's voice grew more impassioned. I want the minister to tell this House, tell the Zambian people, what happens when we hit 75% external debt to GDP? What happens when the next government inherits an even heavier debt burden? Are we creating opportunities or are we, mortgaging our children's future? Socialist Party MP Dr. Fred Membe added his perspective during the committee stage. This bill, colleagues, is a betrayal of the very principles this government campaigned on. They promised us fiscal discipline. They promised us transparency. They promised us they would never return Zambia to the debt distress we experienced under the previous administration. And yet, here we are, barely 3 years into their term, and they're asking us to approve legislation that fundamentally loosens the constraints on government borrowing. He continued, the question we must ask is simple, who benefits? When the debt ceiling is raised, when the minister is given emergency borrowing powers, who profits from those loans? Who gets the contracts? Who gets the kickbacks? Because history, Mr. Speaker, has taught us that, such discretionary powers are rarely exercised in the public interest. In response, Minister Muzokatwain returned to the podium. I find it deeply ironic, Mr. Speaker, that the very same people who presided over Zambia's default on our sovereign debt now stand here lecturing us about fiscal responsibility. This government inherited a financial disaster. We have spent 3 years cleaning up the mess, negotiating with creditors, restoring confidence. And now, when we seek to provide ourselves with the tools to actually deliver development, we are accused of recklessness? The minister's tone sharpened. Let me remind this House, transparency is built into this bill. Every borrowing decision must be reported to Parliament within 30 days. Every loan agreement must be tabled before the Budget Committee. We are not seeking to hide anything. We are seeking to govern responsibly in challenging times. But perhaps the most revealing testimony came from civil society. Judith Mulna, Executive Director of the Zambia Debt Alliance, testified before the Parliamentary Budget Committee in October. Our analysis, of the proposed amendments shows that while the government's intentions may be well-meaning, the risks are substantial. Zambia's debt-to-GDP ratio is currently around 85% total debt. This bill would allow that to potentially reach over 100%, possibly as high as 120% under certain scenarios. That's dangerous territory. Countries at that level of debt burden face severe constraints. They lose policy flexibility, they become vulnerable to external shocks, and they often end up cutting essential services just to meet debt repayments. She added, we're not saying don't borrow. We're saying borrow responsibly, borrow transparently, and borrow only what you can realistically repay. This bill, in our view, doesn't provide sufficient safeguards against excessive borrowing. Deeper analysis. So what does Bill number 7 actually mean for the average Zambian? The implications are both immediate and long-term, touching everything from government spending priorities to the kwacha's stability in currency markets. First, let's understand what happens when debt ceilings are raised. In theory, it provides the government with greater borrowing capacity to fund infrastructure projects, social programs, and economic stimulus measures. Roads can be built, hospitals can be equipped, agricultural subsidies can be expanded. These are tangible benefits that supporters of the bill emphasize. But there's a darker side to this equation. Higher debt means higher interest payments. According to the Ministry of Finance's own projections, Zambia currently spends approximately 28% of its national budget on debt servicing. With increased borrowing under the new ceilings, that figure could rise to 35% or even 40% within the next 5 years. That's money that can't be spent on education, healthcare, or social safety nets. Economic analyst Angela Bwalia, speaking to journalists yesterday, put it bluntly. Every kwacha spent on interest payments is a kwacha not spent on schools, not spent on medicines, not spent on supporting farmers. The trade-off is real, and it's Zambians who will feel it in the form of either higher taxes or reduced services, or both. The opposition has seized on these concerns. Patriotic Front President Edgar Lungu released a statement this afternoon calling the law a recipe for economic disaster and warning that the UPND is repeating the very mistakes they accused us of, except they're doing it faster and with less transparency. But the government's perspective is markedly different. In a press briefing at State House this afternoon, presidential spokesperson Clayson Hamasaka defended the decision. President Hichilema's assent to this bill reflects his commitment to balanced, forward-looking economic management. We cannot develop as a nation if we tie our hands behind our backs with overly restrictive fiscal rules designed for a different era. What matters is not just how much we borrow, but what we borrow for and whether we can generate the returns to justify that borrowing. International reaction has been mixed. The International Monetary Fund, which has been closely monitoring Zambia's economic recovery following the 2020 debt default, issued a carefully worded statement noting that fiscal flexibility must be balanced with debt sustainability and that they look forward to continued dialogue with Zambian authorities on maintaining prudent macroeconomic policies. Translation? They're watching closely, and they're not entirely convinced. But beyond the macroeconomic debates, there are deeper, more troubling questions about governance and accountability. The bill grants the finance minister significant discretionary powers during declared economic emergencies. But who defines what constitutes an emergency? What prevents such powers from being abused? And what happens if those emergency provisions become normalized, used not just in genuine crises but whenever the government finds regular parliamentary oversight inconvenient? Legal scholar Professor Mumbai Kalufia from the University of Zambia has raised concerns. The vagueness of the emergency provisions is problematic. We've seen in other countries how emergency powers, once granted, are rarely relinquished. They become the new normal. And when financial decision-making is concentrated in the hands of one minister, even with reporting requirements, the potential for corruption and mismanagement increases exponentially. There's also the question of timing. Why now? Why, in December 2025, with barely a week until Christmas, does the government need to expand its borrowing capacity so urgently? What projects are waiting in the wings? What loans have already been negotiated pending this legislative change? These questions remain unanswered, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories across social media and in opposition circles. Some analysts suggest that the government is preparing for a major infrastructure push ahead of the 2026 general elections, a calculated political move to deliver visible projects that can be showcased to voters. Others worry that Zambia is being drawn into new debt traps by Chinese and Western creditors eager to finance projects with strings attached. What's clear is that this law fundamentally changes the fiscal landscape. It removes constraints, expands possibilities, and with those possibilities come risks that will be borne not by ministers or parliamentarians, but by ordinary Zambians. Thank you so much for watching today's edition of InspirAfrica Official. This is a story that will continue to develop in the coming weeks and months. The implications of Bill Number 7 will only become fully apparent as we see how the government exercises its new borrowing powers, what projects get funded, and whether the promised transparency and accountability mechanisms actually function as intended. I want to hear from you. What do you think about this new law? Are you optimistic that increased borrowing will translate into real development for Zambia, or are you worried about the debt burden we're creating for future generations? Do you trust the government to exercise these new powers responsibly? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a respectful, informed discussion about the future of our nation's finances. We'll be monitoring this story closely and will bring you updates as new information emerges. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. I'm Nakash, and I'll see you tomorrow with more news, more analysis, and more truth. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay inspired. God bless you, and God bless Zambia.